So we're here to learn about feedback loops, what they are and what they mean. First and foremost, they mean that we are in an emergency now, not later, now. But also, and here's the possibility, we'll learn today that the forces caught up in these feedback loops, the natural balances of nature, are a crucial part of the possibility we have to slow and even reverse global heating if we act to protect these natural balances now. We'll show 3 short clips from our new film series that explains why all of us should educate ourselves and be alarmed. Then we'll hear from 2 scientists, as we've heard from Susan, Doctors Susan Natali and William Mumal, who will help us see the problem, how global heating from our fossil fuel emissions and destruction of our forests are accelerating natural processes that threaten to spin out of control. And, this is important, and they will show us how we can be part of a solution, that if we work together urgently, intelligently, we can hope over time to renew nature's own best technologies for storing excess carbon where it belongs, in the ground. Before we turn to the science, though, we have the great pleasure of witnessing a live encounter, the first ever, as I understand it, between 2 extraordinary individuals. Both are great admirers of science, and both are greatly appreciated by scientists. Your Holiness and Greta Thunberg, it is you who have drawn so many of us together here today, your star power. Both of you live with the urgency of the climate emergency. You're very focused on it, both of you, and you both embody the possibility that we can address it. 2 moral leaders from 2 ends of the age spectrum, from the East and from the West, 2 visionaries who see the future and are calling us to action, calling us to our better selves. So I begin our time together by inviting you 2 into a dialogue. Standing by is Tumten Jimpa Langri, translator for the Dalai Lama and chair of the Mind and Life Board, to assist as needed. Thanks, Jimpala. But Your Holiness, I want to begin with you. Your book that I just held up, Our Only Home, begins with a letter to Greta. You wrote to her in May, and then part of it is published in this book that came out a bit later. I'm going to read your first 2 paragraphs now, and then I'm going to ask for your thoughts as you were writing them, and your thoughts now. This is what you wrote to Greta. I am also an ardent supporter of environmental protection. We humans are the only species with the power to destroy the earth as we know it. Yet, if we have the capacity to destroy the earth, so too do we have the capacity to protect it. It is encouraging to see how you have opened the eyes of the world to the urgency to protect our planet, our only home. At the same time, you have inspired so many young brothers and sisters to join in this movement. So, Your Holiness, my first question to you is, what inspired you to write that letter to Greta? Why did you want to be in touch with her? And how do you see the importance of her work now and going forward? This is your chance. We brought you together. Your Holiness.
When I heard the young ladies, you see, the thinking about environment or these things, I really admire. It is really encouraging now from a young community, a younger member of humanity, now showing genuine sense of concern of our future, of our planet. It is a very, very hopeful sign. Now, actually, you see, everybody wants happy life, no question about that. Not only we human beings, but also, you see, animals, insects, everyone want happy life. And for that, you see, everyone is very much concerned about their own existence. Now, about human being, humanity. In a way, human brain is something very special, remarkable. Yet, judging our world, human being, in a way, most troublemaker. Other animals, you see, their daily life, eat, sleep, sex, but we, much sort of desire, and too much sort of also the sense of we and they. Human history, say, I think among the different species of mammals on this planet, I think we human beings, one way, create a lot of good things, but at the same time, we create a lot of problems. Now, today, world, a lot of problem, even to some extent, the ecology, all this much sort of our own creation. So now, question is why? Our brain, wonderful, but we, you see, too much sort of thinking. Firstly, we ourselves, human being. Secondly, then our nation, our country. Then finally, my family. So eventually, you see, thinking, very small circle. The reality, individual human beings' life depend on the community or family. The family, their life depends on the community. Now, today's world, you see, the entire 7 billion human beings are one human community. So now, time come, we have to think entire humanity. The ancient time, a small circle, we. That now, according to this reality, now you see thinking we, small circle, is now unrealistic. So 7 billion human beings, you see, entire our life depend each other. So
Thank you, Your Holiness. That's beautiful. Thank you. If you don't mind, is it all right if I ask Greta if she would like to say something to you, since she's having the chance now to meet you?
그래서
Oh,
indeed. I'm eager.
Good.
One.
Good. Greta,
Yes.
is there anything you'd like to ask His Holiness or say to him or tell us about receiving his letter, whatever you'd like to say?
Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you for hosting this event, and thank you to everyone who's taking part, and thank you to Your Holiness for being such a loud advocate for environmental protection and environmental action. I can say as a younger generation, we appreciate that very much. We are eternally grateful that you are standing up for us, not only for us, but for the future of the entire humanity and for the entire planet. And also, of course, thank you for your letter and for your support. It means a lot. And yes, although we may be very different in terms of age span and many other things, we share the same goal. We share a common goal, and that is to protect our planet and life on Earth and humanity. And so, thank you once again, Your Holiness.
Thank you. So when I heard this young girl from Sweden, I really felt, there is real hope from our younger generation, who really thinking this environment and these things. So this is, I think, at such a time, we generally world more materialistic thinking. And then finally, small circle, my nation, my community, as I briefly mentioned. So now it is quite rare who talking about world, about environment, these things. I really feel this is a sign of hope for future. Like my generation, now ending. So like you, the younger generation, really, now all our hope depend on these young people.
Yes. Thank you, Your Holiness. Since I'm
close
to your age. Thank you so much, Your Holiness.
It's the past is past. Past is past. Now, future depend on younger generation.
Yes.
I think, anyway, I may say our generation create a lot of problem, sufficient problem. Now let them solve.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we have a short clip from the film series that we're introducing today, and it includes just a little part of the speech, Greta, that you gave at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019. And I know, Your Holiness, that you saw that speech. It's the one, Greta, you sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in a small sailboat to address. And in that speech, you referred to irreversible chain reactions or feedback loops. So before we show the clip, and it's only a couple of minutes, Greta, would you want to say anything about why you thought it was important to raise this issue of feedback loops at that meeting, what you knew about them, and why you thought world leaders needed to hear those words from you?
Well, I mean, it's the speech is very dramatic, but I thought that, at least my experience is that right now there's a huge lack of awareness, and that the science isn't being enough brought it's not being enough discussed and brought in the conversation. So I think we are desperate for a raise in spreading of awareness, and we need to tell people about what's happening right now, because we are, to a large extent, unaware of what's happening. Most people I know, I encounter, haven't even heard of feedback loops or tipping points, chain reactions, and so on. But they are so crucial to understanding how the world works. They just show how complex everything is, that we cannot, that our consequences, that our actions have consequences. We have such a lack of respect for nature and for the environment that we just think that things will work out in the end. We don't seem to think about that our actions have consequences a lot of the time beyond our comprehension, things that we cannot understand, things that we cannot predict. And when these things are set in motion, we can, in many cases, not stop them. So we cannot solve the climate emergency without taking these feedback loops into account and without really understanding them. So that is a crucial step.
Thank you. And we have you both to thank, Your Holiness, for lending your prestige.
You see, it seems we generally thinking, of course, basically human nature is more self-centered, selfish from the birth. But now, you see, for individuals' best interest depend on community. When we say community, entire world is one same human community.
Right.
So now, the taking care yourself in reality, in practical level, we have to think about humanity, about world, thinking world, not sort of religious matter, but practical level. You see, our future depends on entire humanity, on this planet. So we have to think about this planet. It's our home.
Yes.
And then the ancient time, we say east, west, north, south. And within that, different religion, different color, different language. Now these are minor. Now time comes, we have to think about humanity, oneness of 7 billion human beings. We have to think about humanity. So it is important we keep in our mind the individual's future depends on humanity. So we have to think about humanity, happy humanity, healthy world.
Yes.
So,
thank you. Thank you so much. If you'll allow me, we wanted to be able to teach all the millions of people who have logged onto this program a little bit about this idea of these feedback loops. And we have a piece of a film, a very short piece of a film that we'd like to show now to start that process. And then our scientists will explain more, Your Holiness. And you're absolutely right. And you have been so clear your entire life that the only way we solve these challenges now is to find a way to come together as one human family to solve these problems. And what we're hoping from this program is that everyone who has tuned into this will be inspired by you and by Greta and by this new knowledge and information that we're hoping to transmit today, to go out and work very hard together, linking arms together, all of us, to get in front of this problem of the climate crisis. So with that, I would like to start with this first film clip. It's part of the introduction to the series of films. There are 5 films, and one is an introduction. And this short segment that we're going to show begins after the concept of feedback loops has been explained. So just to get us started, let me just offer a simple definitions, and our scientists will elaborate it more as we go along. But for now, if we think of causes and effects in a system, the cause, in our case, and this is Buddhist cosmology certainly helps us understand this, the cause in our case, greenhouse gas emissions, produces an effect. The planet warms. And that effect, hotter temperatures, feeds back into the climate system and causes more heat-trapping gases to be released into the atmosphere, which then accelerates the rate of heating. And on it goes, faster and faster and faster in a vicious cycle. We'll see examples of this problem from our scientists, and then we'll see how the situation may improve if that feedback cycle can be reversed. So that's the basic idea, and the scientists, again, will elaborate. Let's now watch that first film clip.
가져오사.
But it's more than our emissions heating the globe. Something else is at work here. The rising temperatures are setting in motion Earth's own natural warming mechanisms that then feed upon themselves.
The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice.
Emissions from fossil fuels are the input which add heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, raising Earth's temperature and setting in motion self-perpetuating warming loops. Warming as a result of the warming itself. That ever-growing screeching noise is an apt analogy for the damage that human-caused feedback loops are wreaking on the planet. Scientists have identified dozens of feedback loops already in motion. It's imperative that we understand them if we're going to solve the climate crisis. As the climate warms, forests, once removers of carbon, release it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or CO2. Frozen ground in the northern hemisphere thaws and emits CO2 and methane. These are the kinds of feedback loops that lead to further warming, triggering the release of even more heat-trapping gases and raising the temperature even higher. In this series, we will highlight 4 of the major feedback loops impacting climate. The melting of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, increased drought and fires in the world's forests, the decay of organic matter from permafrost thaw in the northern hemisphere, and disruptions to the jet stream and our global weather. Each amplifies warming, and combined, they are spinning out of control.
To help us understand what the world is failing to see, we now turn to 2 scientists who have dedicated their lives to these problems and are here to help us understand them more fully. First, Dr. Susan Natali. Sue, you are an inspiration for your expertise, your dedication, your brilliance, and the compassion that drives you forward into the collapsing tundra. You work in perhaps the most challenging area on the planet now, the rapidly warming Arctic. Difficult work. At the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, you direct the Arctic program. We're eager to learn from you and from your colleague, Dr. William Mumau. Bill, your distinguished career in environmental studies has garnered much recognition, including from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee in 2007 that selected the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for reports on which you and other scientists were lead authors. Bill and Sue will discuss, as examples, feedback loops in 2 kinds of natural ecosystem: thawing permafrost in the Arctic, that's Sue's area, and destruction of the world's forests, that's Bill's expertise. They'll discuss how these 2 systems interact. Sue will go first, and she'll introduce a second short clip from the series. It shows her in the field and in her lab. Sue, would you please explain to us what we need to know about Arctic warming, permafrost thaw, and feedback loops?
Yes, thank you, Diana. And first, I want to also thank Your Holiness and Greta for your leadership, for your powerful words, and for your actions to protect our planet. I'm going to be talking about the Arctic, which is home to a number of important feedback loops. For example, the loss of reflective ice and snow is causing the Earth to absorb more of the sun's energy. As a result, the Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet. But no matter where you live, you've likely felt or seen the impacts of climate change over the past few years, because across the planet, we're seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of wildfire, of heat waves, of floods, and of droughts. But nowhere are the impacts of climate change more severe than in the Arctic, as has been witnessed by Arctic residents for more than a decade. In this next film clip, I describe the rapidly changing Arctic landscape and the impacts on global climate. And I start off with my observations from a recent field expedition in Alaska. So let's now watch the second film clip.
Last summer, while working in her usual field location in Alaska, Natalie witnessed a remarkable acceleration of permafrost melting.
First of all, it was very, very warm. It was 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the tundra. There were places where we walked where my foot fell into the ground because there was no longer any ground structure because the permafrost was thawing. I've never seen change happening that quickly from one year to the next.
To understand how this thawing will impact the global climate, Natalie and her team collect permafrost cores from different locations across the Arctic. In the lab, she analyzes their carbon content and composition to determine how much gas will be released when the permafrost thaws.
These cores were taken from a location that has really organic, rich, deep, peaty soils. And you can tell that when you look at this core because it's really dark brown, and that dark brown color means that it holds a lot of carbon.
The thawing permafrost not only impacts the climate through the release of greenhouse gases, it can entirely transform the landscape, as Natalie has seen in Duvany Yar, Russia.
I had never seen permafrost thaw and ground collapse of that magnitude. You know, I remember driving up to it on the boat, and it was like, wow, this huge cliff, many, many stories high. You see these really, really fine roots that have been frozen for 40,000 years. Once they're thawed, they'll decompose in a year.
So, as you saw in the video, the thawing of frozen ground called permafrost is dramatically altering the land in the Arctic and in other regions that contain permafrost, including the Tibetan Plateau. When permafrost thaws, it can cause the ground to collapse, damaging infrastructure, people's homes, and creating hazardous conditions for the people who live on permafrost. In addition to these direct local effects, permafrost thaw can also impact everyone on the planet. This is because of the permafrost feedback that can warm our climate. The source of this feedback is the vast amount of carbon that's stored in permafrost. There's twice as much carbon in permafrost as is currently contained in our entire atmosphere. 3 times more carbon stored in the permafrost region than is in every tree in every forest on the planet. That carbon has been frozen for thousands of years, and now it's starting to thaw. As it thaws, microbes break down that organic carbon and release it into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases contribute to warming. Warming in turn leads to more thaw, which leads to more heating. This is the permafrost feedback loop. The amount of permafrost that will thaw and the greenhouse gases that will be released from permafrost once it thaws depends on the actions that we take now in terms of limiting fossil fuel emissions and protecting our forests. If we continue to emit fossil fuels at our current rate, permafrost carbon emissions will be substantial. For example, by the end of this century, permafrost carbon emissions may be on par with the current rate of emissions of the United States, the second largest greenhouse gas emitting nation. But if we substantially reduce fossil fuel emissions and protect our forests, we can cut permafrost carbon emissions by more than in half. This will have important consequences for the people who live on permafrost, in the Arctic, on the Tibetan Plateau, and for people across the planet. Importantly, and perhaps surprisingly, this permafrost feedback has not been accounted for in the global carbon budgets that have been used to determine how much and how fast we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit warming. It's critical that decision makers are aware of and account for the permafrost carbon feedback in order to keep our climate under control and to restore the planet.
Thank you very much, Sue. Bill, much of your work has been in the forests. Would you take a few minutes now to explain the complexities of the forests in the feedback loops and in this climate emergency, and the relationships too between the forest and the Arctic?
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Sue. As you've all learned from my colleague, Dr. Sue Natali, the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the globe because of feedback loops, the loss of reflective snow and ice, in addition to the increased atmospheric greenhouse gases. So this extra warming is thawing permafrost soils and releasing even more carbon. In other parts of the globe, warming of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural soils increases the metabolism of plants and soil microbes so that they store less carbon and release more carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere, an important feedback loop accelerating warming. Our warming climate has increased droughts, pests, and has made possible some of the largest wildfires in history. The massive fires this past year in Australia, in the western United States, and in the Arctic have added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and the remaining dead trees cannot remove carbon dioxide. It is essential that we halt warming rapidly so that we can continue to have the benefit of large-scale atmospheric carbon dioxide removal that our forests provide. While carbon dioxide emissions began to increase after about 1750, when industrialization began, half of all human-caused emissions have occurred since the first climate treaty in 1992. As you heard Sue say, halting these direct emissions is essential. But to change our trajectory in the direction of a more benign climate, we also need to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Forests are the most powerful way we have to do that right now, and they provide an important, helpful feedback. While 11 billion tons of carbon is released by human activity each year, the increase in the amount in the atmosphere is just 5 billion tons. Oceans and plants on land remove the rest, and over half of this is removed by forests. Trees steadily accumulate carbon by absorbing atmospheric carbon dioxide through the amazing process of photosynthesis. That carbon makes up half the weight of dry wood, and some of it accumulates in soils as leaves and fallen wood decompose. In older temperate forests, half the carbon is in the soils, and in northern forests, up to 90% is stored in soils. Now, when a forest is cut, much of the carbon from the wood and soils is released rapidly into the atmosphere. About 15% of human-caused carbon dioxide emissions come from forest loss. Forests are cleared for agriculture and urban development, or to produce wood products, and burned to produce electricity in the developed world. There are more effective ways to grow food, and electricity from burning wood emits more carbon dioxide than burning coal. Zero-emission technologies like solar and wind produce electricity with no emissions during their operation, and they do so at a lower cost than burning wood. So I would say that it is better to keep our carbon inheritance, that's what it is, it's an inheritance from the past, that we keep our carbon inheritance in our forests and soils rather than release it to the atmosphere and try to recover it later. Well, even when forests aren't harvested or cleared, scientists who study forests are finding a worrying trend. In the videos, you will hear scientists reporting that forests like the Amazon are accumulating less carbon now than they did even a decade ago. These trends are seen in other forests in different regions as well. An altered climate that is more drought-prone appears to be driving these changes. Forests are at the heart of a feedback loop that can either warm or cool our planet. And we get to determine which direction that goes. In a few minutes, we will describe how we can increase the amount of carbon dioxide removed by forests and soils to eventually cool the planet. But first, we would like to share this short excerpt from one of the climate emergency films.
Well,
With the clock ticking, it comes down to how we manage temperate forests. Use them for commercial purposes or keep them intact to cool the planet. While human activity has kicked off natural warming loops, human ingenuity could reverse their direction, turning them into cooling feedbacks instead. It would mean protecting and expanding forests, preserving marshes, grasslands, and all natural habitats. Using agricultural practices that store carbon instead of releasing it, and letting trees and plants do their job of taking carbon out of the air. This would lower Earth's temperature and kick in a self-perpetuating cooling feedback loop. George Woodwell was an early pioneer warning about fossil fuel use, setting off warming feedback loops 5 decades ago. He's convinced the solution lies with nature's own ability to cool the planet.
We can store carbon in life. If we want to be optimistic, we have to be very progressive in our transition away from fossil fuels and into a new green world. But it takes imagination, interest, and a recognition of the reality of an Earth that is failing at the moment. We can't allow it to be too late.
we can't allow it to be too late. That's why we're here. So we have a few moments, if you would like, for you, Greta, and for you, Your Holiness, to ask questions of the scientists. There was a lot of information packed in those remarks that they offered. So starting with you, Greta, is there anything you would like to ask of either or both of the scientists?
I mean, there's so much to ask, but I maybe to whether you could clarify in what way these effects, these aspects and feedback loops are not included and are not accounted for in, for example, the global carbon budgets, and why is that?
I'll start. Thank you, Greta. So in the models that informed the last reports that advised these global carbon budgets, permafrost was not included in those models. And part of that is because these models are built for the planet and not specifically for the Arctic. And so scientists are well aware of this and are actively trying to get these processes into the models. But sometimes science acts a little bit slower than it needs to when we think about policy, when we think about a climate emergency. So we need to take the information that we have, even if the models aren't perfect. The scientists are aware that this is happening. And when we think about managing for risk, we need to act. Maybe we don't know the specific number, maybe we know a range of numbers, but those numbers are good enough for us to communicate what these risks are.
I might just add that the models as they are tell us a pretty serious problem is on hand. And I think even the scientists who work with those models then are quick to say, yes, but it's really worse than that because of these feedback loops. And as science progresses and we learn more, and as Sue can tell you, it's not easy working in the Arctic. It's not easy to get those kind of measurements and data. But as we get more of it, we'll be able to do a better job.
Your Holiness. Oh,
Sorry.
Greta, go ahead. You had a follow-up?
Sorry. And yeah, because all these like announcements that countries are starting to do now, as for example, net zero 2050 or halving emissions by 2030 and so on, those are based on these incomplete carbon budgets, which gives us a way too low probability of staying below the safety limits set out. Do you think there's a risk in that this is being miscommunicated and misunderstood? And what do you think we could do about that?
I think there's definitely a risk. I mean,